Right now, flowing through your bloodstream is the chemical receipt of a microwave dinner you ate in, I don't know, maybe 2019.
Yeah, and it hasn't broken down at all.
Right. It hasn't been filtered out.
Yeah.
Because the human body, for all its, evolutionary brilliance, simply does not possess the biological tools to dismantle it.
It's an incredibly unsettling reality, actually. We are essentially walking archives of our own convenience.
Welcome to the deep dive. I'm so glad you're here. We are tailoring this one specifically for you, the learner, because we know you want to understand the mechanics of the world without, getting completely bogged down by the endless information overload out there.
Right, the noise is deafening these days.
It really is. And today, we are pulling apart a system that you probably interact with multiple times a day, usually without a second thought. We are examining the hidden intersection of two massive forces. So, ultra-processed foods, what the literature calls UPFs, and PFAS, which are the synthetic compounds more commonly known as forever chemicals.
And when we look at these two elements, we aren't just looking at a dietary issue or a standalone environmental hazard.
No, not at all.
We're looking at how they collectively interact to completely rewire human biology and how they dictate global economics and ultimately reshape the baseline health of our entire society.
Yeah, and the stack of source material for this is intense today. We are pulling from this fascinating mix of recent, really hard-hitting literature. We've got the 2026 Occupational Health and Safety cohort studies. We have recent functional MRI trials out of Nature Human Behavior.
Plus those massive national serum analyses.
Right, and incredibly detailed economic and regulatory reports. So our mission today is to uncover how the modern food system doesn't just feed us, it structurally alters us. It stabilizes society at this lower baseline of health.
Okay, let's unpack this by starting at the absolute ground zero of the modern supply chain. We need to look at highway biology.
Yeah, highway biology. To understand the extreme end of any system, you have to look at the populations who simply cannot opt out of it.
Yeah. So we're starting with this major 2026 Occupational Health and Safety cohort study. They analyzed 9,800 long-haul transport workers.
Well, these are the people physically moving the economy across the continent.
Right. And the data point that just immediately jumps off the page is the metabolic health of this specific group. This cohort presented with a 44% higher incidence of metabolic syndrome compared to the general adult population.
44%. I mean, in a sample size of nearly 10,000 people, that is not some statistical fluke.
No, it represents a systemic population-level shift. And just to be clear on the pathology here, metabolic syndrome isn't a single disease.
Right. It's a cluster.
Exactly. It's a biological cluster. It's the simultaneous presentation of hypertension, elevated blood glucose, visceral adiposity, meaning fat storage around your central organs, and highly abnormal lipid profiles.
Let's actually dig into the cellular level of that for a second. Because people hear metabolic syndrome and they just think, oh, weight gain.
Yeah, that's the common misconception.
But it's fundamentally about insulin resistance, isn't it? Like, the cells literally stop listening to the signals.
That is the core mechanism, yeah. Every time you consume a carbohydrate, your digestive system breaks it down into glucose, which goes straight into your bloodstream.
And then your pancreas reacts.
Right. Your pancreas senses it and releases insulin. And insulin acts as this molecular key, unlocking your cells so they can absorb the glucose and use it for energy.
Makes sense.
But when the system is just bombarded with highly refined, rapid-absorbing carbohydrates, the kind you find almost exclusively in ultra-processed foods, the pancreas has to pump out these massive, continuous waves of insulin.
Just to keep up.
Exactly. And over time, the cellular locks become desensitized. The insulin is knocking, but the cell just refuses to open.
So the glucose just stays trapped in the blood, essentially tearing up the vascular walls, while the cells themselves are paradoxically starving for energy.
Yeah, which triggers the body to store that excess circulating energy as visceral fat, while simultaneously ramping up blood pressure. That is the cascade of metabolic syndrome. Wow.
But the 2026 study didn't stop at just diagnosing the metabolic failure. They conducted comprehensive biomonitoring on these drivers. They drew serum.
And what did they find?
They found that alongside the metabolic collapse, these workers carried a concentration of PFAS compounds that far exceeded the national average.
So higher rates of disease and significantly higher loads of synthetic chemicals circulating in their blood. I mean, why this specific population?
Because of the rigid parameters of their environment. The life of a long-haul driver is governed by electronic logging devices, or ELDs.
Right, tracking every single minute.
Exactly. When a driver's legal hours are up, they must stop, regardless of where they are.
They can't just, cruise another 40 miles to find a nice local farmer's market.
No, they are geographically tethered to the logistics infrastructure. Just think about the reality of an interstate truck stop at 3:07 a.m.
Yeah, the fluorescent lighting, the rows of idling diesel engines. And inside, the environment dictates the diet entirely. The options present this brutal consistency. Heat lamp display cases, heavily packaged meals resting on coated cardboard, grease-resistant wrappers, and sealed plastic containers.
It's a closed loop. It's actually this huge structural irony. The exact people responsible for transporting fresh produce and grain and refrigerated meats across the country are structurally barred from accessing those goods.
Yeah, they are sustained entirely by the lowest efficiency inputs available.
Lowest efficiency inputs, that's a rough phrase.
It is, but it's the analytical term used in the literature, and it is vital here. In this environment, food ceases to be a qualitative choice. It becomes strictly fuel by necessity. The cycle is relentless. Drive, stop, consume what the immediate radius provides, continue.
When you think about it mechanically, it's like running a high-performance freight train on dirty coal, simply because the train is only permitted to stop at coal mines. There's no judgment on the driver at all. It's just pure symmetry with the environment.
And because of that symmetry, the biological response is incremental. When your exclusive input is ultra-processed, chemically encased food, your biological engine doesn't just seize up overnight.
Right, it adapts.
It adapts. The glucose regulation shifts. The lipid profiles drift further from the evolutionary norm. Baseline energy becomes highly unstable, entirely reliant on chemical spikes and subsequent crashes.
Nothing fails immediately. Everything just slowly adjusts down. But, while these truckers are on the extreme end of this exposure, they are really just the canary in the coal mine. How does this chemical exposure apply to the rest of us eating out of microwave trays?
Which brings us out of the occupation low day and right into the general population. We have to look at the silent accumulation, the 2026 NA-ANES serum analysis.
NA-ANES, the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, right?
Correct. It is the gold standard for epidemiological biomonitoring in the U.S. They use massive, demographically representative physical examinations.
So they aren't just sending out email questionnaires asking people what they ate last week. They're literally drawing blood and running it through mass spectrometry.
Yes. And the 2026 data showed something staggering regarding these synthetic compounds. They confirmed that PFAS compounds are now detectable in the serum of approximately 99% of American adults.
Well, 99%. It's virtually inescapable.
It is completely ubiquitous. But the critical finding here was the correlation. The biomonitoring data mapped the absolute highest concentrations of these forever chemicals directly to the demographics with the greatest dietary reliance on ultra-processed foods.
Okay, I want to pause here because this is where the mechanics get really important for you, the listener. We know PFAS is used in packaging to keep things waterproof and grease-proof, but I'm not, chewing on the cardboard sleeve of my frozen pizza. So how is the chemical moving from the packaging into my biology?
This is detailed in a fascinating 2025 study from Environmental Science and Technology. They looked at the physics and chemistry of chemical migration, specifically how PFAS moves from the synthetic barrier of the packaging right into the food matrix itself.
The food matrix. Let's define that real quick because it's a term that pops up constantly in these sources, but it's rarely explained well.
Yeah, so think of a whole food, like a raw almond or a piece of broccoli, as a complex three-dimensional architectural structure. It has cell walls, fiber networks, water bound up in vacuoles. That architecture is the food matrix.
Got it.
When you consume a whole food, your body has to work to dismantle that architecture, which slows down digestion and regulates how nutrients hit your bloodstream.
But ultra-processing destroys that architecture entirely, right?
Utterly. Ultra-processing takes raw commodity crops, pulverizes them, extracts the starches and oils, and then extrudes them into new synthetic shapes. The natural matrix is obliterated. What you are left with is a highly porous, unstable sponge of refined macronutrients.
Wow. And how does that degraded sponge interact with the forever chemicals in the packaging?
The 2025 study demonstrated that migration is driven by three intersecting variables: heat, fat content, and storage time.
Heat, fat, and time.
Right. So when you place a highly processed, fat-dense food item into a PFAS-coated container, say a microwavable tray of macaroni and cheese, You are creating a perfect chemical solvent environment.
Because the fats in the food act as a solvent.
Yes, many of these chemicals are lipophilic, meaning they bind readily to lipids or fats. Add to that the element of storage time. These products often sit in warehouses and on store shelves for months, allowing a slow, continuous leaching of the barrier chemicals into the fat content of the food.
Just slowly seeping in.
Exactly. And then the consumer introduces the final catalyst heat. Microwaving or baking the product excitedly accelerates the molecular transfer.
So by the time the fork actually hits your mouth, the chemicals have fundamentally integrated with the meal. The barrier has literally become an ingredient.
And upon ingestion, those compounds cross the intestinal lining and enter systemic circulation. Which leads us to how the body attempts and fails to process these foreign entities. The 2026 Toxicology Reports meta-analysis looked specifically at the biological half-lives of the most prevalent PFAS compounds.
Namely, PFH excess and MFOSA.
Right. You know, when I think of a half-life in a biological sense, I usually think of, like, a medication. You take an ibuprofen, a few hours later, half of it has been cleared by your liver. The timeline is measured in hours. What are we looking at with these forever chemicals?
We are definitely not looking at hours. The toxicology data confirms that the half-life for these compounds in the human body ranges from 3 to 8 years.
Wait, years. So if I eat a microwave meal heavily contaminated with MFOSA at age 30, my body will not clear 50% of that specific exposure until I am 38 years old.
Correct. And it will take until you are 46 to clear half of the remainder, making you down to 25%. Why? What makes it so resilient? The human liver is this incredible filtration machine. Why does it just fail against this?
It comes down to fundamental organic chemistry. The defining characteristic of these molecules is the carbon-fluorine bond. In all of chemistry, the carbon-fluorine bond is one of the strongest, most stable single bonds in existence.
Okay.
Your liver relies on specialized proteins, primarily the cytochrome P450 enzymes, to dismantle toxins. These enzymes act like microscopic crowbars, prying apart the molecular structure of alcohol, medications, and natural toxins.
But when the biological crowbar hits the carbon-fluorine bond,
It simply bounces off. The bond is too tight, the electronegativity of the fluorine atom is too strong, the liver cannot dismantle the molecule, so it just recirculates it back into the blood.
this brings a terrifying new dimension to the concept of body burden. Because if the half-life is up to 8 years, it means the board is never cleared between meals.
Exactly. The clearance rate is vastly outpaced by the exposure rate. Let's trace a standard, highly normalized dietary pattern. A commercially baked pastry in a grease-resistant sleeve for breakfast, a fast food sandwich in a coated wrapper for lunch, a reheated, tray-based meal for dinner.
Wait, so it's essentially a game of biological Tetris where the blocks never disappear, they just keep piling up. Every wrapper and coated tray is leaving a microscopic, permanent receipt in our bloodstream.
That is a perfect analogy. Multiple exposures every single day against a clearance rate measured in decades.
That is wild.
And no single one of those wrappers is acutely toxic. If you eat one coated burger, you will not experience systemic failure. But you are adding today's chemical ledger to yesterday's and tomorrow's to today's. Over decades, this daily arithmetic creates a rising physiological baseline. The accumulation just stacks relentlessly.
And a rising chemical baseline forces a biological response, right?
Yeah.
The organs don't just passively hold these chemicals, they have to react to their presence.
They do. The biomonitoring data reveals the precise nature of that reaction. We see significant renal filtration stress. Your kidneys are continuously attempting to filter out a synthetic compound that was literally engineered by chemists to be indestructible. It places a chronic, low-grade mechanical strain on the nephrons, the microscopic filtering units of the kidneys.
We also see immune suppression mentioned quite heavily in the literature.
Yes, the persistent presence of these synthetic molecules downregulates immune responsiveness. The body's defense mechanisms just become blunted. And crucially, we see elevated serum cholesterol, which loops us right back to the metabolic syndrome observed in the logistics workers. The accumulation actually alters lipid metabolism in the liver.
So our filtration organs are exhausted, our immune system is suppressed, and our metabolism is destabilizing. But as we dig deeper into the source material, it becomes clear that it's not just our organs filtering these chemicals that adapt. The very circuitry of our brain and hormones is being patched by this exact same food system.
Which brings us to Section 3, Rewired from Within, the neurobiology of cravings. To fully grasp this, we have to look at the 2025 Nature Human Behavior Neuroimaging Trial. This study moved beyond just blood tests and placed subjects directly into functional MRI machines.
Let's explain the fMRI methodology for a second because it's brilliant. They're tracking blood oxygen level dependent signals, right?
Yeah.
Watching where the blood flows in the brain second by second.
Exactly, the bold D signal. When a specific region of the brain activates, it requires more oxygen, and the fMRI tracks that microscopic rush of oxygenated blood. The researchers compared the neural response to ultra-processed foods against the response to minimally processed whole foods. And crucially, they matched the meals for calories and macronutrients.
So calorically, a serving of the processed snack and a serving of the whole food snack looked identical on paper.
Calorically identical, yes, but neurologically, they were entirely different realities. The fMRI imaging revealed that the UPFs triggered massively amplified activation in the brain's reward centers, specifically the nucleus accumbens and the ventral tegmental area.
The brain lights up like a fireworks display for the processed food, but barely registers a flicker for the whole food. Why is that? If the calories are the same, why does the brain care?
Because of human evolutionary biology. For 99% of human history, we existed in an environment of caloric scarcity. Our brains evolved to fiercely reward the discovery of calorie-dense foods to ensure survival.
And food scientists know this.
They understand this evolutionary wiring intimately. They utilize extrusion technology and chemical flavoring to achieve what the industry calls the bliss point.
The bliss point, the optimization of salt, sugar, and fat.
Right. It's the precise mathematical ratio of refined carbohydrates, extracted fats, and sodium that maximizes dopamine release while minimizing the physical sensation of fullness. It is a hyperpalatable stimulus that simply does not exist in nature.
But, triggering a dopamine reward isn't inherently dangerous. Like biting into a perfectly ripe peach triggers dopamine. The danger comes from what happens to the biological brakes, doesn't it?
Precisely. And this is where we have to discuss leptin. Leptin is a hormone produced by your adipose tissue, your fat cells. Its primary job is to communicate with the hypothalamus in your brain.
Okay.
When you consume enough energy, your fat cells release leptin, which crosses the blood-brain barrier and binds to receptors, basically signaling, hey, we have sufficient energy reserves, cease consumption.
It's the physiological kill switch for hunger.
Exactly. But under sustained exposure to a diet dominated by ultra-processed foods, that circuitry degrades. The sheer volume of refined sugars and rapidly absorbing fats causes systemic inflammation, particularly in the hypothalamus, and over time, the leptin receptors downregulate.
Let's use an analogy here to make this mechanical. It's like buying a house right next to a busy train track.
Yeah.
For the first few weeks, the noise of the train passing wakes you up every single time. That's the leptin signal, loud and impossible to ignore.
Right.
But after living there for a year, your brain neurologically filters out the noise. The train is still blasting its horn, the signal is still happening, but your brain has recalibrated its baseline to completely ignore it.
That is a perfect representation of leptin resistance. The fat cells are screaming that they have enough energy, but the inflamed hypothalamus has gone completely deaf to the signal. So the brake pedal is disconnected. Meanwhile, the dopamine pathways, the reward circuits, require ever-increasing amounts of the hyperpalatable UPF stimulus to achieve the same feeling of satisfaction.
The accelerator is welded to the floor, and the brakes are completely cut. Stimulus leads to reward, but the blunted leptin means you experience reduced satisfaction, which immediately drives an increase in intake.
And that is just the neurological impact of the food matrix itself.
Yeah.
Now, we must layer in the chemical packaging, because the 2026 Endocrine Review synthesis provides a critical missing link here. It examines how PFAS compounds behave hormonally once they accumulate in the bloodstream.
So they aren't just inert toxic blocks, they are active endocrine disruptors.
Endocrine disruptors are exogenous chemicals that interfere with the synthesis, secretion, transport, or binding of natural hormones. Hormones operate on a lock-and-key mechanism. A specific hormone has a specific shape that fits into a specific cellular receptor.
And the forever chemicals can mimic those shapes.
In many cases, yes. The synthesis notes that certain PFAS compounds have the structural capacity to interfere directly with thyroid function. The thyroid gland regulates baseline metabolism, how efficiently your body converts fuel into energy.
Right.
When PFAS molecules bind to thyroid transport proteins in the blood, they alter the availability of active thyroid hormones.
Let's step back and look at the totality of this internal environment for a second.
Yeah.
You have a dietary structure, the UPFs, that is intentionally engineered to hijack dopamine and induce leptin resistance.
Yes.
Then, migrating out of the packaging of that exact same food, you have a persistent synthetic chemical that actively disrupts your thyroid and your basal metabolism. The chemical presence amplifies the hormonal instability that the food itself created.
What's fascinating here is that this entirely reframes the behavioral reality of the modern consumer. From the outside, observing a population with rising obesity and metabolic rates, the action of overeating appears voluntary. Society operates on this deeply ingrained narrative of willpower and personal responsibility.
Right, just make better choices. Just put the fork down.
Exactly. But internally, beneath the level of conscious thought, the human operating system has been mechanically altered. The biological parameters of choice have literally been rewritten.
So when people blame themselves for lacking willpower, they're actually fighting a biological operating system that has been deliberately hacked. Craving is no longer about needing energy. It's just a conditioned reflex.
It is a war fought on three distinct fronts: neurological, hormonal, and toxicological. And it is a war the human body is structurally designed to lose when placed in this specific environment.
Which forces a massive, unavoidable question. If this food hacks our brains and accumulates in our bodies, why is it everywhere? If it's this damaging, why is it the dominant foundational architecture of the global food supply?
To answer that, we have to pivot from biology to economics, because while the human organism is visibly failing under this regime, the economic engine that produces it is operating with flawless, unprecedented efficiency.
The math is cold, but it really explains everything. We're looking at a 2025 earnings breakdown from Forbes, which conducted this granular financial analysis of major multinational food conglomerates.
And we are impartially reporting this data, just to be clear. The Forbes analysts separated the portfolios of these corporations into two distinct categories: their ultra-processed food divisions and their whole food or minimally processed agricultural divisions. They then compared the return on investment, or ROI, between the two.
And the divergence is just staggering. UPF sectors outperform whole food categories by a factor of 3.4 in ROI.
3.4 times the return. In global finance, that kind of sustained margin differential doesn't just dictate corporate strategy. It dictates the physical reality of the entire marketplace.
But how? Why is a box of extruded, chemically flavored starch 3.4 times more profitable than a crate of fresh apples or a bag of raw oats? Where is that massive margin coming from?
The margin is generated through the elimination of the biological clock. Whole foods are biologically active. A fresh apple is slowly dying the moment it is picked. It is rotting.
Right.
Therefore, the logistics required to move that apple from an orchard to a grocery store before it spoils are phenomenally expensive. You need a continuous cold chain refrigerated trucks, climate-controlled warehouses, rapid transit. And despite all that, a significant percentage of the product will inevitably spoil and be written off as a total loss.
The biological clock literally eats the profit margin.
Exactly. Now look at the engineering of a UPF. You start with the cheapest, most heavily subsidized, infinitely scalable commodity crops on Earth: field corn, soy, and wheat. Through intensive industrial chemistry, these base materials are deconstructed into isolated starches, high fructose syrups, and hydrogenated oils.
You strip out all the water, all the fiber, all the unstable biological elements.
And you reassemble them into thousands of different proprietary products, stabilized with synthetic emulsifiers, and wrapped in PFAS-coated oxygen barrier packaging. The biological clock has been entirely deleted.
Wow.
A box of processed crackers can sit in an ambient temperature warehouse for 18 months and sit on a retail shelf for another year. There is zero spoilage cost. There is no cold chain required.
And when you combine that eternal shelf life with the neurological hijacking we just discussed, the engineered bliss point that guarantees repeat consumption, the 3.4 times ROI isn't a mystery at all. It's the inevitable mathematical result of this system.
However, there is a fundamental law of economics. Costs do not disappear, they are simply shifted. The fact that these highly profitable, shelf-stable foods induce metabolic syndrome and biological degradation is not free.
No, someone is definitely paying the bill for the sickness.
And the 2026 Lancet Commission update attempted to quantify that exact bill on a global scale. They analyzed the global health burden directly attributable to diets dominated by ultra-processed foods. To measure this, epidemiologists use a metric called DALYs.
Dailies. Disability-adjusted life years. This is a really crucial metric to understand. It's not just a body count, is it?
No. One daily represents the loss of the equivalent of one full year of optimal, healthy life. It is a composite metric that combines years of life lost due to premature mortality with the years a person lives burdened by severe disability or chronic disease.
So it captures the agonizing reality of the slow decline. The decades spent managing severe type 2 diabetes, the dialysis required for failing kidneys, the loss of mobility.
Exactly. And the Lancet Commission attributed a staggering 14.2 million annual dailies globally directly to UPF-dominated dietary patterns.
14.2 million years of healthy human existence, systematically erased every single 12 months.
Right. And the Forbes data makes this a pure math equation. It's vital to view this objectively, devoid of emotion. We aren't talking about a cabal of executives actively conspiring to poison the public. It is purely about structural incentives. The system doesn't intend to make people sick. It simply requires alignment with profit.
Health outcomes are irrelevant to revenue models.
Precisely. Corporate fiduciary duty mandates the maximization of shareholder ROI. The current reality is that shelf-stable, hyperpalatable engineered inputs yield a 3.4x return. The health outcomes, the 14.2 million dailies, are classified in economic terms as externalities.
Here's where it gets really interesting. It's basically like a factory that dumps its toxic waste into a river to save money. The factory's profits look amazing on paper, but only because the local town, or in this case the global healthcare system, is footing the bill to clean the water.
The food system operates on the exact same economic mechanism. A conglomerate sells a highly profitable, chemically packaged snack. They capture 100% of the margin at the point of sale. A decade later, when the consumer develops metabolic syndrome and requires lifelong insulin therapy, the conglomerate does not receive the medical bill.
The externalized cost is absorbed by public healthcare systems, by national insurance structures, and by the citizens themselves through out-of-pocket expenses.
Right, the stable loop is clear. Produce low-cost goods, drive repeat consumption, externalize health impacts, sustain demand.
But if the costs to society are this high, and the mechanism is this obvious to economists and toxicologists, where are the referees? Why hasn't regulation stopped this? We have massive federal agencies specifically designed to prevent this exact type of public harm.
To understand the lack of intervention, we have to examine the denial infrastructure. The regulatory architecture, which the source material describes not as a shadowy conspiracy, but as a system of regulatory inertia. Let's look at the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, and specifically their GRS framework.
GRS, generally recognized as safe.
This framework originated from the 1958 Food Additives Amendment. The original intent was actually entirely logical. The government realized it would be an absurd waste of resources to demand multi-million-dollar, multi-year clinical safety trials for ingredients that humans had consumed safely for centuries.
Like vinegar, salt, baking soda. Those were generally recognized as safe.
Right. A perfectly reasonable administrative shortcut. But over the decades, the regulatory reports show how that 1958 loophole was expanded and re-engineered. Today, the GRAS framework operates largely on a system of self-affirmation.
Wait, self-affirmation?
Yes. When a chemical company synthesizes a novel emulsifier or a new barrier coating, they do not have to submit the compound to the FDA for independent, government-mandated, double-blind safety testing before introducing it to the market.
I'm genuinely confused here. They synthesize a brand new chemical, never before seen in nature, destined for human consumption, and they don't have to prove to the government that it's safe.
Under the self-affirmation loophole, the company can privately convene its own panel of scientific experts. This industry-funded panel reviews the internal data, determines that the new chemical is safe, and the company simply sends a notification to the FDA stating that they have self-affirmed their own product's safety.
They literally grade their own homework, and the agency just files the paperwork.
That is the functional reality documented in the 2026 Congressional Oversight Report. The report audited the safety dossiers submitted for regulatory consideration in recent years. It found that approximately 92% of the foundational safety data relied upon by regulators was funded, conducted, or directly commissioned by entities with deep financial links to the industry producing the chemical.
92%. When the data pipeline is entirely controlled by the entity seeking approval, the outcome is a foregone conclusion. But what about the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency? We've known about PFAS contamination in drinking water for years. The EPA regulates that. Why are they allowing it in the food supply if they know it's toxic in the water?
It is a profound structural compartmentalization. The agencies operate in distinct legal silos. The EPA has a mandate regarding environmental exposure of waterways, soil, air emissions, and under immense public pressure, they have slowly begun adjusting allowable thresholds for PFAS in municipal tap water.
Okay, progressing incrementally on drinking water standards.
However, the FDA holds jurisdiction over food packaging.
So the EPA says, this chemical is too dangerous to drink. Well, the FDA simultaneously allows the exact same chemical to be wrapped directly around the food you are eating.
And because of the slow migration out of the packaging into the food matrix, the heat, fat, and time variables we discussed, the food pathway is now a primary vector for human accumulation. Yet the regulatory response remains fractured. Risk thresholds are simply framed within acceptable economic parameters.
So when we see a company make a voluntary pledge to phase out a chemical, we shouldn't view that as a victory endpoint, but rather just a tactical move to delay strict regulation while they find a new, equally profitable alternative.
This raises an important question, right? How does the system adapt to oversight without ever actually halting its momentum? The system maintains trust through the appearance of rigorous action. The documentation details a specific, repeating playbook utilized over the last 3 decades whenever a new chemical threat breaches public awareness. It is a 4-stage cycle.
Walk us through the cycle.
Stage 1. Independent, non-industry researchers identify early biological signals of risk. They publish biomonitoring data showing accumulation like the NAAS data.
Stage 2 must be the immediate suspension of the chemical, right?
No. Stage 2 is the initiation of prolonged regulatory review. Committees are formed, hearings are scheduled, and the industry inundates the process with their 92% funded safety dossiers, arguing that the independent data is inconclusive or doesn't prove direct causality. This review period predictably stalls action for years, often a decade or more.
While the biological Tetris blocks keep falling into the bloodstream of the population.
Exactly. Stage 3. As public pressure mounts and the data becomes entirely undeniable, regulators adjust the exposure limits. They don't ban it immediately. They establish a slightly lower acceptable threshold. Finally, stage 4. The industry issues a highly publicized voluntary pledge.
Like, oh, we are listening to our consumers. By 2030, we pledge to voluntarily phase out the use of chemical X in all our packaging. We see these press releases constantly.
The reports explicitly state that these pledges must be analyzed functionally. They are public relations signals, not biological endpoints. Because during the years of delay, the chemical companies haven't been idle. They have been synthesizing a regrettable substitution.
A regrettable substitution.
They alter the molecular structure of the banned PFAS by a single atom. It is no longer legally chemical X, so it evades the specific ban. They introduced the new, similarly structured chemical under the GRAS self-affirmation loophole, and the entire cycle resets.
The system never actually halts, it just shapeshifts. The appearance of oversight remains completely intact, while the underlying flow of UPFs and PFAS continues unabated.
All of these isolated pieces, the biology, the accumulation, the economics, and the regulations, point to a unified, chilling reality about how modern life is structured. This brings us to the final synthesis paper in our stack, titled Thursday's Reckoning.
This paper is where the true weight of everything we've discussed finally lands. Because when you stack these layers on top of each other, a unified architecture emerges.
Let's review the architecture. Biologically, we have accumulation without clearance. The half-lives guarantee the body burden only rises. Economically, we have profit without responsibility. The 3.4x ROI is fiercely protected, while the public absorbs the 14.2 million delays.
Occupationally, we have necessity without alternative. The logistics worker trapped in a nutritional desert to keep the supply chain moving.
Neurologically, we have drive without equilibrium. The dopamine accelerator is mashed to the floor while the leptin brakes are disconnected. And chemically, we have substitution without resolution, the regulatory shell game.
The synthesis paper argues that through this convergence, the fundamental definition of food has shifted. Historically, biologically, food is a transactional input for function. You consume calories, your body utilizes those calories to repair cells and generate kinetic energy, and you survive.
But when the input, the degraded food matrix infused with synthetic barrier chemicals, actively and continuously degrades the biological system it is meant to sustain, the transaction is no longer neutral, it becomes directional.
Directional, that is a heavy concept.
The system is not heading toward a sudden total collapse. If the ultra-processed diet immediately killed the consumer, the economic engine would rapidly lose its revenue base. Collapse is unprofitable. The system requires living participants.
So what is the direction?
It is stabilization, but stabilization at a lower baseline of health. The paper terms this the architecture of managed decline. No single drive-through meal seals your fate. No single microwaved plastic tray guarantees metabolic failure. The biological shift occurs precisely through normalization over immense stretches of time.
The slow, imperceptible drift of cholesterol profiles, the quiet, chronic exhaustion of the renal nephrons, the gradual dulling of the leptin receptors. We are perfectly stabilized as consumers' reliable nodes generating repeat revenue while being simultaneously systematically degraded as biological organisms.
And within the reality of managed decline, the synthesis paper poses a structural inquiry into human agency. The transaction of eating has become directional, ensuring the consumer remains a participant in their own gradual dismantling.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating the grocery store?
It demands that we examine the boundaries of our own free will. The author asks if the fuel required to keep the machine running is the exact same fuel that slowly dismantles the operator. Where does our autonomy end and our forced participation begin?
When you reach for the hyperpalatable, mathematically optimized snack, are you exercising conscious choice? Or are you simply executing the programming dictated by agricultural commodity subsidies, synthetic chemical lobbying, and neuro-engineered flavor profiles?
Seeing the pattern is the point, because once you see the converging layers, the invisibility of the system vanishes.
We have covered immense territory in this deep dive. We started on the Midnight Interstate, observing how the relentless logistics network structurally guarantees the metabolic degradation of its own workers. The truck stop reality.
We tracked the physics of chemical migration, watching how heat and fat pull indestructible carbon-fluorine bonds right out of the packaging and embed them into our cellular structure, creating these permanent chemical receipts in our blood.
We peered into the fMRI scans, witnessing the deliberate hijacking of our neural pathways, where whole food satiety is bypassed in favor of a synthetic dopamine loop.
We analyze the cold, rational mathematics of corporate fiduciary duty, where the elimination of the biological clock yields a massive profit margin while externalizing the devastating cost of human sickness.
And we decoded the illusion of regulatory safety, where self-affirmed loopholes and compartmentalized agencies ensure that the flow of toxins never stops. It's a heavy realization. But understanding this architecture of managed decline is the very first step toward reclaiming your autonomy. You cannot defend yourself against a mechanism you cannot see.
But now you know how the gears turn. You are equipped to view the grocery aisle and those headlines about chemical bans through a radically clear lens.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you with one final thought to explore on your own. We have spent this whole time discussing our own body burden, the steady accumulation of these compounds over the course of our adult lives.
Right, the ledger we have built through our own exposures.
But if our current global economic machine operates perfectly, by stabilizing adults at this artificially lowered baseline of health, what happens to the baseline of the next generation? The children who are born inheriting the accumulated body burden from day one? If the mother's blood is already carrying a lifetime of synthetic packaging, the child does not start with a clean slate. Are we evolving alongside our engineered food, or just surviving it?
It really is the defining biological question of our time.
It is. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the systems built around you, and we'll see you next time.